Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 2024 Giller Book Club. My name is Daphna Rabinovich, and I will be your host tonight. Please make sure to have your Zoom on a side-by-side view for the best possible experience. It is with great pleasure that I introduce you tonight to our interviewer, Andrew Sullivan. Andrew is the author of The MARIGOLD, named a Best Book of the Year by the Verge and the Winnipeg Free Press, and The Handyman Method, a novel co-written with Nick Cutter. Sullivan is also the author of the novel Waste and the short story collection All We Want Is Everything, both named Globe and Mail Best Books of the Year. He lives in Hamilton, Ontario, and tonight he will be interviewing Menaka Raman-Wilms, whose novel The Rooftop Garden was longlisted for the 2023 Scotiabank Giller Prize. The last 15 minutes of this hour-long interview will be devoted to questions, so feel free to pose your questions in the question icon at the bottom of your screen. So I don't want to waste any more of your time. Please join me in welcoming Andrew and Menaka.
Right. Thank you so much for having us. Very excited to talk about the Rooftop Garden here today. Menaka Raman-Wilms is a writer, a journalist based in Toronto. You probably have heard of her. She's the host of The Decibel, the daily news podcast from the Globe and Mail. Previously, she was a parliamentary reporter for the Globe and Mail and an associate producer at CBC Radio 1. She has a master's in creative writing from the University of Toronto and a master's in journalism from Carleton University. She's also a classically trained singer. For several years, Menaka reviewed books for the Ottawa Review of Books and has moderated panel discussions at Ottawa's Prose in the Park Literary Festival. In 2019, Menaka's story Black Coffee was shortlisted for the CBC Short Story Prize. She received the Young Writers Award from the Arts and Letters Club of Toronto at the Alice Munro Festival of the Short Story in 2016, and won Room Magazine's 2012 Short Fiction Contest. So we're here today to talk about this novel, The Rooftop Garden, but before we dig into that, I think it's best that we hear a little bit about it. So, Menaka, would you read some of the novel for us?
Certainly. Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. Daphna, thank you as well for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you, everyone who's on the call as well, for joining us this evening. I think this is going to be really fun. But yes, Andrew, I will start by reading a little bit of the book, if that works, probably about 3 or 4 minutes. I picked a passage. This is a passage I often read because I think it sets it up well. It's from pretty early in the book. The book goes between the time of when Nabila and Matthew, when they're grown and when they're children. And so this is one of the first passages of when they're children. They're about 8 years old and they're playing after school. So here we go. Matthew hasn't heard about how cars are heating up the world. So Nabila tells him. She says it's why the ice at the North Pole is melting. And the more that everyone drives, the hotter everything gets. Soon the ocean will rise and swallow up Vancouver. She can only tell him things like that when Tara Lynn isn't listening, because sometimes Matthew gets scared. Then Nabila gets in trouble. So she waits until Tara Lynn is reading baby books with Samir on the other side of the rooftop, and then she and Matthew duck behind their hedges. It's only when they're in their secret forest hideaway that Nabila can tell him things like that. This is why our forest really is on top of a building, Nabila says one day. Water flooded the city and everybody had to leave, and then trees just started growing over all the empty buildings. Their roots probably poked through the concrete and started breaking all the glass. Matthew is eating his after-school snack, a chocolate chip granola bar. He stops chewing and looks at her. A piece of granola sticks to his lip. Where did everyone go? He asks. Maybe some of them didn't make it. The rest went into the mountains. Why didn't we go with them? Nabila shrugs. We got left behind. Matthew's eyes get wide. The forest is eating the city and we're stuck on a building, he says quietly, his mouth still full. Nabila plants seeds so they can grow food. She digs 6 small holes in a row, drops in for 10 seeds, then covers them back up with dirt. She realizes that pieces from the granola bar would make perfect seeds. Maybe we tried to go too, she says, as she reaches over and picks up a few bits that Matthew dropped on the ground. But we got stuck. There was too much water. She digs new seed holes and places granola in each one. Matthew squeezes the last bit of the bar out of the wrapper and hands it to her, and she breaks it into little bits and lays them on the earth. Don't waste the chocolate chips. He reaches over and picks them out and drops them on his tongue. Tara Lynn always remembers that chocolate is Matthew's favorite. Every Friday, she brings them an after-school treat, and Nabila notices that the treats always have chocolate. Matthew's only been coming home with them for a few weeks. It started in mid-September. They were walking home one day, and Tara Lynn noticed Matthew. He was walking up ahead of them, alone. Nabila wondered why he was allowed to go places on his own, and Tara Lynn said that they should invite him to join them. So the next day, when Nabila came out of school to meet Tara Lynn and Samir at the edge of the teacher's parking lot, Matthew stood there too. Tara Lynn handed them both Tupperwares of apple slices, and they walked home together. Tara Lynn said she'd arranged for him to stay with them after school until his sisters arrived to pick him up. Nabila wanted to say no, but her brother could barely just walk, so at least she'd have somebody her own age to play with. Matthew isn't in the regular grade 3 class like Nabila. He's in the 2-3 split, which everyone says is where they put the smart grade 2s and the stupid grade 3s. Nabila had never talked to him before, but she knows that some kids made fun of him because one time at recess, he'd picked up a frog and it had peed on his hand. Matthew turned out to be okay. When Nabila talks, he mostly just listens. She figures out that if she plans a game, he'll play it. If she makes up rules, he'll follow them. That's why they always play the forest game. It's Nabila's favorite. Her mother is a scientist and teaches Nabila a lot about the environment, including all the ways the world is changing because it's getting warmer. Humans cut down too many trees, and trees are the things that make the air pure. Then humans drive too many cars, and car pollution turns the air to poison. Glaciers melt and flood the ocean. Turtles swallow plastic bags because they look like jellyfish. Matthew doesn't seem to know any of that stuff. So while they play, Nabila tries to explain things to him. He scares easily. He listens to her with his mouth hanging open, his eyes round and too pale blue. When she tells him there's a big hole in the sky over the South Pole, he worries everyone will die when outer space rushes in. They always go to the rooftop after school. Tara Lynn and Samir sit in the gazebo, and Nabila takes Matthew to the garden to play. There's a small row of hedges, some rose bushes, and a few plants that have big leaves and don't grow very tall. There are also flowers. Then there are the 2 sandbar willows that tower over everything else. Nabila loves the trees. They have long, thin branches that stretch up towards the sky, and the leaves hide their forest from everyone else. That's where she and Matthew play, in the dirt between the plants, where nobody else can see them. And I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, that's great.
Great.
Thanks so
Thanks.
much for sharing. I think
Yeah,
that's a great place for us to start off with the book too. You know, it is very much this story of Matthew and Nabila's relationship. And that's sort of that line in there about them being left behind, I think kind of speaks to something, you know, that's come up with a lot of the reviews and a lot of the responses to your book about this sort of, what I found reading it, a profound sense of alienation and isolation, not just for Matthew, who, I mean, we're going to try to not spoil things here, but we do have to
Just
talk
in
about the
case.
book, folks. Yeah, but you know, Matthew ends up being led down a fairly radicalized path. There's a lot of the hallmarks of somebody who gets brought into that world. You do a very great job of sort of crafting that progression for him. But Nabila's also, to me, extremely lonely, alienated, and sort of disconnected from her community, from people around her, from the larger world. And, you know, her loneliness might even be more profound to me because it's, you know, she's working in a university laboratory with, you know, basically only her experiments as company.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyone
She
else?
doesn't always have a lot of interaction. Yeah.
No, and the interaction is often very like hierarchical or structured, right? It's like, oh, this is my student, this is my prof, this is my, the relationships are defined. So, you know, with a book like this that you obviously spent a lot of time crafting and working on, what drew you to kind of this, I don't know, I felt it was very thematic, that intertwining of these two lives that are so disparate. Where did that come from, I guess, for you, or where did that
Mm.
sort of obsession with loneliness sort of grow from?
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely it was a really big part of it when I was writing the story. And I think you're right, Andrew. I think um both of them are experiencing loneliness. They're experiencing kind of different kinds of loneliness, I guess, but of course everybody experiences things differently. So that would be the case really with that with anyone. But I thought there was kind of a similarity between them. So they do live very different lives, right? Nabila is an academic. Matthew, as you've kind of alluded to, we might get into some spoilers, I guess, but you know,
Yeah, we have to.
he's you know, he's working at a restaurant and he gets radicalized essentially. But the book does connect them is that they are both lonely. And I guess it was just kind of something that I've been thinking about. It's kind of in the zeitgeist. We talk a lot about loneliness these days, about how, you know, we're more connected than ever in this world. We can talk to people instantly. We can have all these connections online, especially, right? But when it actually comes down to the human interactions, sometimes that's really lacking. And so even though we have all of these modern connections, a lot more people are feeling lonely. We see that with older people. We see that with younger people as well, especially. And so that's kind of something that I wanted to explore with both of them, how both of them, even though they're experiencing the world in such different ways, how both of them could kind of be lacking those connections. And then also, what is the effect of that? So for Matthew, I think it's a little bit more obvious. Maybe the effect of that is, you know, he tries to find human connection and he ends up finding it kind of through this, you know, this group that radicalizes him. But for Nabila, maybe it's a little bit more subtle. You know, her loneliness is she's really lacking she doesn't have that many friends. Like even when she's kind of off in Germany with Matthew, like she doesn't really have people necessarily looking out for her or people that she's checking in with and stuff. And so and she ends up, you know, making some of her own connections in Germany, but that's a little bit you know, they're not necessarily close friends either, right? So it's kind of this theme I guess in a way, even though they're in such different places as characters, this was kind of a theme that brought them together. It was something that they were, you know, both actually experiencing, even though they're experiencing it in different ways.
Yeah, and they almost seem to, you know, even when that relationship between them, which is not a romantic relationship really or anything, it's a connection from their childhood. They're still trying to force it so many years like
Yeah.
there like there's a gap there, and instead of like I got the sense of Nabila really trying to like imbue that with some meaning, because then that part of her life would mean more, or it wouldn't
hmm
just be something that could be left in the past. And so they're both sort of groping for that, while, as you said too, like there are other relationships happening along the margins that
hmm
they don't seem interested in, or they don't seem to see the same value in. So yeah, that was really kind of haunting part of the book for me.
I think part of that is like Nabila remembers that childhood friendship, and she remembers in a way, even though it was for a short time, being close to Matthew, maybe in a way
Yeah.
that she hasn't been to a lot of other people, right? So that might be, you know, in my mind, kind of part of what drives her towards him is, you know, there was that really strong connection at one point that you all often want to hold on to those.
Yeah, exactly. That's sort of like almost fatal nostalgia
Hmm.
to go back to something that would never exist again.
Yeah,
And speaking of that, let's talk about Berlin. No,
we should though. We will.
we
We will.
should.
I
No, we're
hope.
going to. We are. That's what we're going to do now. So Berlin plays a big part in this book. It's obviously, you know, sort of stretching between Canada and Germany here. Matthew goes there, Nabila follows. Berlin also has this really great presence as sort of a place. I want to get into talking about cities too, but the part of the Berlin
Mm.
part of the story that stuck out to me was the war tree, this sort of tree growing through a building and cafe that kind of carries that same sense of loneliness as the characters that we were talking about. And so the natural world has a strong presence in this book. Obviously, part you read for us tonight really is pretty clear about that. but I'd love to hear you sort of expand on the origins of that tree, its sort of reciprocal in real life, where it might exist, and its sort of
Mhm.
place in the story. Because I do feel like the war tree kind of prefigures a lot of the story that's about to be told. And it's there with us from the start.
Yeah, the war tree. So this is the tree. It's in the cafe in Berlin. So Cafe
Yes.
Arboretum. This is the tree that grows up through the store and has been like the store was basically built around this tree. So I have to say this is something that I did not see in real life. This
Oh
is
yeah.
a
Okay.
figment of my
The
imagination.
novelist at work. Yeah.
But it came from this idea of when I was in Berlin, I was really struck by how the city kind of does incorporate nature and urban landscapes together. I really love the city, and this is one of the reasons I think. I guess I often, growing up in Canada in like urban environments, I often think about the process that I have always seen is we cut down trees to build buildings and build parking lots and all kinds of things, right? But it was almost kind of the reverse process I was noticing in Berlin, where there were a lot of old buildings, especially left over from the war, and that city's been through a lot, right? And some places weren't rebuilt, were abandoned, and you would get nature kind of taking over again, growing up through these buildings. It was like the reverse process, and I was really fascinated by that. It's a beautiful thing too, to like, especially in this age where we're talking so much about the destructive effect that humans have on the environment, to see the natural world kind of reclaiming its space there. And so that tree, I guess, really it kind of symbolized that for me. Going through Berlin, there were so many little instances of, old railroad tracks where there's trees growing up through. Or I remember seeing pictures of the old museums that had been, I think, bombed during the war and then had been left for a while before they were repaired. And same thing, like plants growing up this old staircase, and it's almost like this kind of surreal fairy tale. Just yeah, it really struck me that was something about Berlin that really struck me, the integration of those urban and natural spaces. And so the war tree for me kind of represents that, even though it is a space for people. It's a bookstore, it's a cafe, it's a home. It really has such a strong presence, and like kind of the foundational presence of that place was this giant tree.
Yeah, no, I think like it really works well for the book. Like I think it kind of gives it almost that, for a lot of the storytelling, that central spire that so much of the rest of the story kind of builds up around.
Mm,
And, it does also kind of create like a little home base for us to retreat to in the narrative, and kind of a resting place in between. So I thought that was really cool, and
mm,
just sort of an effective way of um, getting your themes across. What I really loved about this book, or why I think it works really well, is like there's so many opportunities for you to be extremely heavy-handed, like and like didactic and sort of morally instructive. And I think
mm.
you really hold back from that, and you kind of let the characters breathe and the space breathe, and I really appreciated that.
Oh, thanks.
So like speaking, sort of following on, we were talking about those differences between Toronto and Berlin. Berlin as this sort of place in flux and humanity kind of coming back, but also, I mean, Nabila and Matthew's experiences. How do you see, I mean, do you live in Toronto now? What is
I do
the,
live in Toronto now. Yeah.
yes, I thought
Yeah.
so.
Mhm.
People put it in their bio, but then they lie, and they,
No, that one's true. That part's true.
that part's true. Okay. But you do get some, well, I'm also sort of away for 8 months. Um, So I guess your experience of those two cities, like there were parts of this that did feel very true to Canada as well. And so how did your experiences of the cities, you've talked about a bit about Berlin, so maybe we'll talk about Toronto now,
Yeah.
but the sort of personality brought to these places, and there's this idea often, the hokey, the city as a character, but I do feel that's often true. We just need to get better about talking about atmosphere and place and
Mm.
space in novels rather than trying to attribute it to character. But how you see your character sort of existing in these places, and sort of what the atmosphere of Toronto might do to a character, I guess.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it's funny. I've thought a lot about Berlin in this sense because this is kind of where the characters go to. So
Yes.
Toronto is almost like it. I mean, it is the place they come from. I guess that makes sense in my life too, because I was from Toronto and I was, visiting Berlin for a while, and that was the journey I was on. But Toronto, I think it really, the part of the story that's set in Toronto is when they're children, and so it's on top, mostly on top of this building where they're playing in this garden. And so that kind of idea of Toronto, and even later when Nabila's older, she's planting a tree, she ends up on top of a roof as well. And so it's kind of a very vertical city, and it is this place of imagination. So it's almost like certain surreal elements, I guess, in their version of Toronto as well, because often when they're in Toronto, they're picturing a different kind of Toronto, which is a Toronto that's been flooded by the ocean. And so basically all that's existing in their version of Toronto is just the tops of these buildings when they're children playing this game. Everything else has been kind of covered. And then it's been taken over by sea animals, and they've got all this imagination of the things that would be going through the streets, that the whales and the sea turtles and stuff. So I guess the Toronto that is in the book really is a Toronto, like a Toronto of a child's imagination in a way, this specific kind of imagination. And yeah, it's very kind of vertical. And I think as a kid too, when you're up high, that's not always it's a unique perspective to you, because you're always looking up at the world, and this is them on top of the building looking down and having that kind of reverse experience. So yeah, that's it's a good question. I think that's really how I think of Toronto though, in this sense. And Berlin in my mind, and this book it's a much more expansive place. This is a place where the characters are in danger and they're experiencing new things. Then that really contrasts to the Toronto of the book.
Yeah, there are a few scenes too where they are a little bit older, right? Those
That's
run-ins
true,
later,
actually, yeah.
the apartment visits, but there is a sparseness to it, which you do feel, especially once you get out of the core, where you're just sort of driving around and there's towers everywhere, but you have no connection to them or what's going on within them. And
Yeah.
that's
Yeah,
sort of,
it's a little less personal in a way, right? Like you're right. Matthew's working in like a strip mall, right? Which is kind of, one of the nondescript places. There's so many of them in the city, right? So it's a little bit more kind of gray and nondescript compared to things
yeah.
in Berlin.
Well, the driver's city versus the cyclist city a little bit.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, and I think you bringing up, that natural world they see overtaking, um, in the book, in the marketing, I mean, in the cover, right beside your head there. Uh, a lot of, how this novel was kind of pitched was like, in the ways of examining climate change, radicalism, extremism, and yet, we're not getting a sort of hyped up Mad Max Fury Road here. What we're getting is very much part of this world from a child's perspective, the way Nabila talks about it. And I love kind of how you structured that and how it's told to the reader. But I also love how it's just sort of part of the story. That's how I approach it with my own work too, is that there's almost this idea, or there was this idea of like climate fiction, which really to me is just realist, or is now, or is what's happening. And so, it comes up in your book without a severe case of didactic lesson teaching, but what part of you wanted to, or where did it come from to kind of make that fairly core to the narrative, the reality and how you chose to depict it of our current, again, like climate reality, not a fiction, not a story. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's just because it is our reality now, right?
Yeah.
We're at a point where this is the state of the world, and we all kind of have to accept this in order to, maybe do something about it, or at least to kind of live in this world. That's what we have to accept. And I think so. The characters in the novel they're in their 20s, so I kind of think of them as a little bit younger than me. So maybe like a Gen Z characters, maybe very late millennial, but maybe Gen Z there. And I think even I feel like I've grown up most of my life knowing about the climate crisis, but I think people who are a little bit younger than us, they really have known it their entire lives. And they've also kind of known that they've been set up in this way by previous generations, that people up until this point have not really done anything to help them. And it's falling on their generation to have to deal with a lot of this. And I think that can cause all kinds of emotions in someone, right? Like there's an anger that might rise up. There's a sadness, you know, all kinds of things. And that's, I guess, what I was looking to explore a little bit about how we often talk about how people are affecting the climate, but really how the changing climate is affecting us as people and our emotions and how we're seeing things and how we feel about the world. And so that's really kind of why I wanted it to, you know, Nabila, since she was a child, this is just the reality that she knows. This is just the world that she's experiencing. And how does that shape her, the decisions that she makes? You know, there's, I think, some stuff that we're going to get into soon too, Andrew, about like the kind of, you know, her wanting to change things and feeling kind of guilt for not being able to change things, and you know, she's a scientist, she's trying to do something in her own way to make the situation better. And that's really how the climate crisis has impacted her. Matthew, it's kind of different. Everyone reacts differently, right? He's kind of at a point where he's feeling hopelessness and he's lost his way and he doesn't really know what to do. He's looking for some source of meaning. So yeah, I guess I really wanted to look at the way that we are affected, and especially young people these days are affected by the state of the world and the state of the climate.
Yeah, and that really leads well into, I think, my next question here, where I'm gonna jump around a little bit, but I'm talking about Matthew's sort of, you know, his brand of extremism that you have in here. You know, it's got a little bit of nationalism, it's got a little bit of men's rights, it's got a little bit, but it does ring true in a way, but you still leave it vague beyond the really heavy macho posturing, and there's obviously an intent there to kind of leave it open. So, you know, can you expand on where Matthew's sort of gang that he falls in with comes from? I grew up sort of working in a lot of male environments, especially in my early 20s, and you do sort of capture the groupthink and sort of vicious uh hierarchies that kind of get developed. Um and you know, I just want to kind of hear from you about making the deliberate choice to kind of keep this vague and not sort of create your own terrorist organization, but still, you know, you kept it very grounded in real actions from Matthew and the people who kind of, you know, abuse him in this group and kind of use him as a tool. So
Yeah.
just sort of where maybe you drew from for that, where you might have seen it, and how you
Mhm.
wanted to depict it.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right in saying that it is vague, and it is purposefully vague,
Yes.
to I guess really to emphasize the point that a lot of these movements are very similar at their core. Like a lot of um the yeah, I don't want to say listeners necessarily beliefs, but a lot of um the lines, or the way that they structure themselves, the tenets of things are very similar. And so I didn't want to necessarily tie it to one versus the other, because I think in this way you kind of see that it could be this or it could be that, and then you do kind of, the similarities then are brought to the forefront. I will say the start. So when I started writing this book, it was back in 2015, I think. So the initial, yeah, when I was still like formulating things, I was in Berlin for 6 months that year, and that was the year. I'd been there kind of during the summer and then the fall, and then that was the year the Paris attacks in November of 2015, and that was a real, I don't know, it felt different being in Europe when something like that happens. I was used to, you know, if something was happening in Europe, being in North America, you feel very, very far away. You are physically very far away. And so I remember kind of experiencing that from Berlin, not in Paris, but just the kind of the fear that was there, the closeness. You could tell the tensions were rising. The tensions were rising for all kinds of reasons too in Germany, because a lot of people were coming over, a lot of refugees were coming into Germany. There was a wonderful like welcome culture in Germany. A lot of people were very receptive to that. Of course, a lot of people are not receptive to that as well. So there's emotions that go alongside that as well. So there was a lot of tension in that space. And the next, I think it was the next year, there was an attack at a Christmas market in Berlin, a Christmas market I knew really well. And so this idea of kind of these random terrorist attacks in public spaces were kind of happening as I was forming this. And so I guess that kind of showed me where the end point I knew kind of with Matthew's storyline there. But at the same time, I didn't want to specify exactly what his beliefs were, because in a sense it didn't really affect his motivations were, he's looking for connection, he's looking for people that, that he can feel a part of something. And I think that's a lot of motivation for these groups too. Like there's all, different people are motivated by different things, but at its core, there's a group feel that's really central to it too. So that's really why I wanted to keep it vague. And, that's part of, but that's at least part of the journey, I guess, what I was thinking about when it came together.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, to see, yeah, that closeness, sort of rewriting your idea of what these experiences are like. And I think, yeah, the distance between here, we've got our own versions, but I think you capture that well too. This isn't something where Matthew's like solely afflicted by the internet. There is a materiality and a personality to it that sort of lures him in. And I thought that was really important as well, that it wasn't just this like, oh, and then there's a bad guy on the internet who emails him, like grounding it in a relationship, which he is so desperate for, and
And
wants
that's
to
like really
succeed.
why he gets pulled in too, right? Because there's that, he feels a connection with people, with a couple of people, and one guy in particular, right? And it's like it's a really powerful thing.
Yes, exactly. And I think that to me spoke more volumes than, oh, well, we needed this exact definition, or I can't follow the story. I think if anything, like the human motivation is what makes it work really well. And so talking about things that work and how we make things work, you have this structure in the novel where you're going back and forth in time, and you're pretty consistent about it throughout. And so just, talking more broadly, I guess, from like a craft perspective and from your perspective as a novelist and somebody who, like you said, you started working on this 2015, books take a while. So the idea of sort of how you've structured the book, the timelines, and when to bring in people's voices, I guess, what was your design, your grand design for this? And was there any sort of discussion with your publisher, with your editors, about sort of the pattern of the story and jumping back between these timelines?
I can tell you there was no real grand design, because I think I rewrote it a few times, and then I would go back and leave it for a while, then rewrite another section, and then to change another section. So there was definitely no grand design, but the idea of going back and forth in time, I knew I wanted to do early on. And I guess the reason for that was I guess I wanted to, these characters were kind of both fully formed in my mind as adults and as kids. And I really wanted to explore in a way how their experiences as kids inform them later on, or how you could see as kids, they're already kind of, because of the way that they're, the things that they're given in life, that just kind of, where they're born, the family they're born into, that situation, how that sets them up even from a young age to take different paths. Of course, nothing is predetermined, but just this idea that you can see even when, Nabila is 8, she's been given all this knowledge, she's been given kind of these ideas, the ability to expand on these ideas and have this wonderful, rich imagination, this whole other kind of imaginary life. She has the space and the ability to do that. And Matthew doesn't always have that. And so I kind of just wanted to look at how you could maybe see those things early on and how that kind of affects them later on, and especially their relationship early on. So we talked before about, the connection that Nabila feels with Matthew, even though she hasn't really seen him in years, but there was this really intense period of when they were kids where she felt very close to him. And because of that, she feels compelled later on to try to be there and support him. So really kind of that interplay between how one of those things affects the other.
And I think we can come back to that now too. Like we've been talking about it and kind of walking around it. But Nabila's relationship, like so much of with Matthew here, to me, and this might only be because I was in a previous life raised as a very Irish Catholic man, by very isolated Irish Catholic people, but it's just deeply suffused with guilt and sort of a lot of inward pressure
Hmm.
on herself. And so despite her pity for him, there's also parts of her that resent him in some ways. I think it's in one of the child chapters, maybe later on, where there's almost this disgust that he can't pretend correctly. Like she's trying to tell this, nature story, and he's like, "Oh, and there's pirates." And Nabila's like, "Oh my God, no,
She's like,
okay."
that doesn't work in the
Yeah.
nature. Yes.
Yeah. And then she's like, "Okay, there's pirates, but like, here's how we'll get rid of them." And he's like, "No, they also do submarines." And she's just so frustrated. And I mean that, you're creating what we're going to see later too, is that disconnect
Mm.
between them. No matter how hard they're pushing, they're still kind of alienated. And so I just want to kind of talk about, or have you expand on that guilt that informs Nabila's character, and that she really has this sense of responsibility, whether it's towards her experiments in her lab that she
Mm.
paranoidly phones back, needs updates on her plants, but also, towards Matthew, there's this like deep need to solve a problem, but I don't know if she has the tools to do it. So where's that coming from? And how do you see that character, I guess,
Mhm.
that sort of sense of guilt?
Yeah, it's funny. I never really thought of it as in guilt, but I can see why it can be framed like that. But I guess to get back to some of the things we were talking about before,
Yeah.
like I kind of bring it back to her loneliness and
Yeah.
her I guess her feelings towards climate change and the need to try to do something, kind of the anxiety around that.
Hmm.
So yeah, the I guess especially with the climate change, because she's thought about this so deeply since the time she was a child. She knows that she can't do a lot with that. She can do some stuff in her own little corner of the world, right? Her research that's looking at like warming oceans. She's trying to affect change in that little way, but she knows in the grand scheme of things she can't do much, and it's kind of this feeling of helplessness, really. But I think with Matthew, she finds it a little bit more tangible. She's like, this is the lost guy right in front of me, and I have this, I had this connection with him that maybe I can actually do something positive here. And so it's kind of her desire to try to do good and to try to change things, and she channels it towards him in that sense. So yeah, it's kind of an attempt to do something, kind of born out of an anxiety of not really being able to control much in the world that you're in.
You do have this one scene too that really stuck with me, where she has to go, he's in Germany, and she has to go to his apartment, and
Oh
she
yeah.
sort of encounters like how little she actually knows him. And like there's this great sort of moment of her going through everything in his room and realizing like almost none of this makes like correlates to who she knew when was a child, right? Like there's
She
this,
realizes she has no idea who this guy is. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And she's put all this stuff on the line, and the one sort of bit of resonance there is that his sister is still sort of like, "Oh, that guy? Yeah, sure." Which is sort of the through line from his childhood. But I think those moments are really effective or useful because it's sort of showing that overlap, I guess. I mean, I do think the sense of responsibility kind of gets instilled in that piece you read today, right? Where it's
Mm.
like Terrellin's like, well, we got to bring this kid.
Yeah.
And then that almost gets, imbued into her as a person, which
Hmm.
is kind of haunting and a little bit devastating, to realize like that's how early you're shaped by the older
Yeah.
people.
And I mean, maybe not all of us, but certainly no, I mean, certainly Nabila definitely feels that. And, even just the idea that her mom, would talk about these things when she was a kid too, right? Climate change
Yeah.
was a very real part of that for her. And yeah, I mean, it's funny though. You wonder, I guess I was wondering about this too as I'm writing, like how many of these things that you learn as a kid do shape you, right? Obviously some things stick, some things don't, but you never really know what are the things that do. So
No, there's no scorecard, right? There's
no.
no like, oh yeah, you have 10 points here because your dad left you at baseball practice. Yeah. It's really
Poor
there's
kid.
not a sweet science to it. And I mean, I also
Mm.
appreciate for the book that you weren't either like, okay, here are the top 10 reasons that Matthew joins this cult. It's a little bit more gradual and left to the reader to make some of those decisions, which I think really matters. So I've got like one last question here before we kind of hand things over.
To the
Now,
audience questions.
yeah, before we get to the audience questions. So you and I have a common background. We both did the U of T Creative Writing MA program. I don't know if they made you take bibliography or not, but that was
I don't think I had to
unique.
take that.
Oh,
No.
they changed it, thank God.
No.
But one of the most significant parts of the program when I was there was you did this sort of year-long mentorship with another writer. And I guess for me, it really did influence a lot of how I worked. My mentor was Miriam Taves, and she ended up working with me on a few books. And I would have these like craft questions and things, and she was like, "Doesn't matter, just finish the freaking book, man. Just like get it done." And it was really, a great experience. But I just for you, like, how much does like mentorship matter? Did it inform your process? What lessons did you kind of take away from it? Or like I often look back or look at people going into these programs and I'm like, hey guys, this is like paid time to write. Like this is the time to like learn about your voice and what you do. So what did you kind of take away from that experience and how much did it sort of influence this book?
Yeah. Oh my God, I learned so much during that program. Those 2 years were phenomenal. I had great classmates, so we used to do workshop even after the program. But that mentorship year, like you said, Andrew, was phenomenal. I worked with Camilla Gibb, who's wonderful. Yeah, and like the two of us we still remain close, and she's a fantastic writer. I felt like I learned so much during that year. I've been thinking about kind of how to explain how much I learned. I think I would have gotten there eventually, but I think it would have taken me like 10 years to learn all those just from my writing. The amount of practice time I got in that year and that one-on-one mentorship was so key. Camilla really just helped me understand like where to focus. I think I used to really over explain as a writer, and she had to kind of help me like find that fine balance of, trusting your reader and knowing that they are going to do the work of putting things together too. So I think that was a huge part of it. And like you said too, Andrew, like just the time that you get to write is huge, because that really doesn't happen, unfortunately, in this world. Full-time writer doesn't really happen very often for a lot of us, right? So we're all working jobs and we're writing on the weekend or in the evenings or something, right? And so that really protected time, that whole year where you could really think through ideas. And that's the thing, writing takes time, right? You're always going over ideas and reevaluating what you wanted to do. So having that space to write and learn as a young writer, it was key. It was really huge. I wasn't working on this book at the time. I was working on something else, but it ended up basically being a practice novel, and I took the techniques and everything that I learned and put it into this one. So
yeah, no, the
it
practice novel is a very real thing. Yeah. And I do think too that sort of sense of restraint you're talking about like comes through in this book, where you're not just like, and then this is like that over explaining, again, that sort of moral didactic nature of like some contemporary fiction. Like it was kind of refreshing to be in this space where we're presented with a bunch of characters and their actions, but we're kind of, the readers participating in the story and making meaning out of what the writer's providing.
And I think readers do that anyways, even if writers,
oh yeah,
even if writers don't mean it to be the case, readers end up doing that, right? So
100%, yeah. You can never
know
know exactly what your audience is going to take away, but that's like part of the process as well. So but I really got that feeling reading this, and it's good to hear that that was Camilla passing down the knowledge.
Yeah,
it's very valuable.
Huge.
Yeah, awesome.
That was huge.
All right, so I think we'll see what kind of questions we've got today. Again, just using that Q&A if you guys have questions. So I think what we'll kick off with is just a little bit of our own discussion, kind of cutting back to, um, I would say the environmentalism angle here,
Mm,
and um, a little bit of what I got out of this was from Jeff Vandermeer's, the guy who wrote Annihilation. You know him, probably, the author. He's spoken a lot recently about the expectation of writing about climate change and how it's supposed to provide a positive or a hopeful outlook, or how it's supposed to sort of
mm.
uplift people. But, you know, if you go to someone writing a serial killer novel, you're not like, well, I thought the ending was a real downer. Um, so
Yeah, it's specifically, well, not specifically, but often with climate fiction, you get that. Yeah, that
yeah, it's
idea.
like you have to be, and, you know, seeing how this book was presented, or how this book was, um, yeah, this book was really kind of shown to the world. I think, like, there's so much more going on than just this climate angle, and you weave it in really well. And so to me, you know, what kind of obligation did you feel to include it? Like,
Mm,
because it's so prominent, like with the cover and with, you know, even the blurb on the back. It's like, this is about climate.
hmm.
And obviously it is, but I want to kind of have you expand on how that was just woven in. I know we talked about being realist, but
Yeah.
it's more than that.
I honestly, I didn't really feel a need to present a hopeful vision of the climate crisis, or, hope at the end or anything. I think that might just be because this is it's often it's about the dread that we feel, and like this stuff I was talking about before about how the climate crisis is impacting us. That's really what I'm feeling with it, and
Yeah.
that's kind of what I wanted to present with it. I do just in my other job as a journalist, I think about this a lot, because we often think about this when we're presenting climate stories. We'll often, if we're interviewing a researcher or something, like we'll ask a lot of what they've discovered or what's new, but we'll often at the end try to weave in of like what gives you hope, because I think it's because it is so bleak sometimes that we're looking to, in a way, when we're presenting these stories as journalists, try to present something hopeful to the audience. So I actually think about that in that sense too. And I don't think it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it is good to, if you're hearing a lot of dire information, sometimes it is nice to have a point of light, or something to kind of look towards. I think that might be important for us as humans just to have. But I don't know, as a novelist, I don't really, at least in this, maybe in this specific situation, I didn't really feel the need to do that, because I really did want to explore the other side of it, the kind of darker things this might be doing to us. We're doing some awful things to the planet, but that process can really be doing awful things back to us in terms of our emotions and our feelings. So yeah, I didn't feel the pull too much, at least on when it comes to the fiction writing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mhm.
And to the idea to frame, I guess, framing Nabila as like an academic,
Mm.
or a, like, this cloistered person, my question, I guess, or what we're kind of seeing, how, why did you decide to go that route? Was it be the sense of isolation, or some old dream of being an academic, or where was this? Did you want to
Well,
be in the lab with the plants?
I no, I never really went down that road, but um, I, I do find it really interesting sometimes to write about scientists in particular, uh, just because they're in this position of devoting their entire life to one very specific thing. And I think
Yes.
it's kind of interesting that often is the case when you're focused like that in your day-to-day life, you kind of end up seeing the world through that lens. And I think I had this realization years ago. I think I was reading a Jane Urquhart book about, I forget now, it was something about butterflies. Sanctuary, someone's gonna be able to remember the name of this book. Sanctuary Lane or Line, I forget exactly what it is now. And it's funny, I don't remember all the details of that book, but specific things really stuck out to me. And it was a scientist, and she was kind of seeing the world through her specific specialty. And I just thought that was really fascinating, because it's such a core part in a way of who you are then, and it changes your outlook on the world. And so because Nabila is so focused on on the planet and the climate, she obviously wants to spend her days doing something that's going to benefit things. And so for her to do that, and be a scientist, focus on a specific form of research, it seemed to make sense that a person like that would want to kind of delve in a specific way. And then it kind of gives the I guess the benefit for the book is that she really is seeing everything through her lens of ocean warming and what's happening to the planet. So yeah, I guess that's it. That would, yeah, writing about scientists is interesting, I think, because of that like specific lens that you get to kind of play with in a way.
And I mean, speaking of how people view the world through, their function in it, we can now, I think, maybe talk a bit about your own day job and how, how does that sort of function with the fiction? What do you take away from it? What do you put back into your fiction? Just from that day to day? It is very hard to escape having these things in your life overlap.
Yeah.
But it can also be very reductive. Sometimes people being like, oh, you do this job and therefore you're going to write about these things. So what kind of, I guess, skills or experiences have kind of been drawn out of that? You're talking to new people all the time. You're dealing with a changing world all the time. And so what can you take away sort of for your own fiction and your creative process?
I definitely do find that I am thinking about things for my job. So I'm in news. I do we do like a long form, 20 minutes is long form podcast every day on a news event. And I do find that does inspire what I choose to write about, just because I'm just learning different things about the world all the time. And one day we'll be doing something on health or the environment, or different wars that are happening, like all kinds of things that are happening in the world. And so I think a lot of that did come into this book, because obviously a lot of environmental stories, we've done a lot of thinking about those things, a lot of extremism stories as well. Like that's just kind of been a prevalent thing really in our world, and kind of the background for the, I don't know, last decade, 15 years. Like it's just been kind of sitting there as a constant background thing. So, sometimes we do all kinds of stories, and obviously I don't end up, delving as deep on all of them, but sometimes things stick with you. I find stick with me from that job, and really, just really make me think about things a little bit more deeper, and I want to explore them in different ways. So and I guess I should say I wasn't a journalist for the entire duration of writing this book. But
you
I've
had
always,
other origins, right? Yeah.
but I've always paid attention to news, and like always found that interesting. So I do think that kind of crept in from that side of things.
Great. So we have a few more questions here from our audience. So I'm going to try to
Wonderful.
make sure we address them all. So we'll try to keep the answers fairly short, but go. Just I like our conversational style here, but I want to make sure we address everybody too.
We'll get through them. Okay.
Yeah. There's only a few here. So writing the novel, what character did you enjoy most creating, and why?
Good question. I mean, both Nabila and Matthew. I think Matthew in particular, there was something very kind of simple in a way, especially writing him as a kid. It was very, he felt like such a vulnerable character, and I guess getting to explore that and explore how other people interact with that vulnerability. I found it. Yeah, I found it really interesting and kind of different to write. So I guess I will say Matthew. Yeah, and especially Matthew as a kid, and Matthew older. Matthew in general.
All the Matthews. They're all one guy.
All Matthews.
Yeah. And so when you are, we're talking about the transition between writing and creating fiction, and so from our audience here, what task do you do to inspire writing, or what kind of turns your brain into that mode? What makes Menaka fiction come out?
Yes, good question. Usually I go for a walk, honestly.
Go for a walk.
It sounds so simple, but yeah, going for a walk and just thinking about things, or like having a nugget of an idea and turning it over in your head. Yeah. Also,
I would agree.
Can I go back and revise? I liked writing about Matthew. I also really liked writing about Tyranny. We haven't touched on Tyranny.
That's true. We have not.
But she is such a fun character. She's the woman in Berlin who has the Airbnb that Nabila stays in, and she's just kind of wild and yeah, she was very fun to write. I will add her to that answer.
Yes, she's great. For people who have read or are going to read the novel, Tierney also takes us to an abandoned theme park in Berlin, which is very exciting, and it's a great sequence in the book. We won't spoil it for you here, but yes, Tierney is a great part of the book, and definitely sort of bound up with Nabila's choice in Berlin. So
yeah, and
please check
that
out.
theme park was probably my favorite thing to write. I will say that was a very fun sequence.
Yes. So more abandoned theme parks in fiction, guys. That's the goal here. That's what we want to do. And I think for another question from our audience here, I think it's a great one to kind of sort of start bringing things to a close on. What is a book that you think everyone should read?
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
I
a good
know.
question
Sorry,
too.
real easy, real easy one for you at the end
Well,
here.
I will say we were just chatting before, Andrew. I've been rereading some Alice Munro because, of course, she passed away last week. So I think myself, like a lot of us, have been thinking about her. And if you haven't read Alice Munro, I mean, you've got to read Alice Munro. I started my first book I read of Munro's was Who Do You Think You Are? And I still think that's just a fantastic book of short stories. And you just, I don't know, every time I finish a story, you're thinking about it for days after. So yeah, I'll say go back and read some Munro.
Yeah. No, those are real exercises in craft and a real sort of flex on storytelling and how to kind of build a world out of just a couple people. So I think that's a great choice. And also kind of, yeah, I can see definitely how much faith you put in the reader for your characters and the stories you're telling here. You leave a lot of space for us to participate. And I think there's also that sort of in Munro's work as well, that you have to kind of slide your way into the story and see what's really going on. So honestly, yeah, this was great. Thank you so much for talking to us today about your book, for that reading. Everybody make sure if you haven't read The Rooftop Garden, you're going to. And if you have, you buy other copies and give them to people. It's the best thing to do.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you everyone for being here too. It was really very fun to be able to do this.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us this evening. I hope you enjoyed it just as much as I did. And if you know anybody who did miss this, it will be available on our YouTube channel in the upcoming days. And please don't forget to join us on June 11th to hear author Ruth Rakoff interview Kezia von Schaik, whose book We Have Never Lived on Earth was longlisted in 2023. If you subscribe to our book club mailing list, you'll be sent a registration link. And if not, just visit our website to register yourself. Thank you so much again, Menaka and Andrew, and good night to everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, guys.